The dress was the color of wheat at harvest. Elsie had spent 3 nights sewing that fabric by candlelight, her fingers aching and her eyes burning, but none of that pain had mattered while she pushed the needle through with care, stitch by stitch, building something she had never had before, a night where she might finally belong. It was not a noblewoman's gown. She knew that. The fabric was simple linen dyed a warm golden hue, nothing like the embroidered silks that the daughters of the great Pax wore when they entered the great hall of Iron Vale Castle. But her friend Mara had helped her press the seams flat with a warm stone, and together they had threaded small dried flowers along the collar, pale white blooms that grew near the river where Elsie fetched water every morning before the rest of the servants woke. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever worn. And tonight, Owen had promised her it would matter. Owen Hart was a beta of modest rank, the second son of a merchant family that supplied grain to the castle kitchens. He was not powerful. He was not feared. But he had warm brown eyes and a habit of leaving a small bread roll on the corner of her serving tray on cold mornings, and for someone like Elsie, an Omega with no pack, no family name, and no standing within the walls of Iron Vale, that small kindness had felt like more than enough. 3 weeks ago, standing beside the river while she carried 2 heavy buckets back toward the kitchen quarters, he had told her he intended to claim her at the harvest gathering. "I'll call your name in front of everyone," he had said, smiling in that easy way of his. "You won't have to stand alone anymore, Elsie." She had believed him. The harvest gathering was the most important social ritual in the Iron Vale calendar. A night when pack members publicly acknowledged bonds, warriors declared allegiances, and unmated wolves could formally step forward to claim a chosen partner before witnesses. For a lone Omega with no pack protection, being publicly claimed by even a low-ranking beta meant safety. It meant a name that could shield her. It meant that the older nobles would stop looking through her as though she were part of the stone floor. She had believed him, and she had sewn the dress, and now she stood at the edge of the great hall with Mara beside her, watching the torchlight move across the high stone walls like slow fire. The hall was enormous. Iron Vale Castle had stood for generations upon generations, its walls built from dark granite quarried in the mountains to the north, and the great hall reflected that ancient weight. Stone columns rose toward vaulted ceilings hung with banners, deep crimson and black, the colors of the ruling pack, House Vale. Long tables of heavy oak filled the center of the hall, already crowded with warriors, nobles, merchants, and their families. Servants moved between them carrying platters of roasted meat, clay pitchers of dark wine, and baskets of bread still steaming from the ovens. The smell of the room was overwhelming. Wood smoke and roasting boar, pine resin burning in iron braziers along the walls, the warm, earthen scent of many wolves gathered close together, and beneath all of it, something older, something that lived in the stone itself. The scent of power, of authority that had never been questioned. Elsie pressed her hands together in front of her and breathed slowly. "You look lovely," Mara said quietly beside her. Mara was a kitchen servant like Elsie, 2 years older, with quick dark eyes and a practical way of seeing the world. She had braided Elsie's long blonde hair that evening, weaving it neatly over one shoulder, and she had not said a single discouraging word about the plan, which, Elsie suspected, meant Mara had doubts she was choosing not to share. "Do you see him?" Elsie asked. Mara looked across the hall. Her expression shifted, barely enough to notice. "He's near the east column." Elsie followed her gaze. Owen was there. He stood with a group of men she recognized as associates of his father's merchant circle. Men with round, comfortable faces and good wool tunics. He was laughing at something one of them had said, and at his side stood a young woman Elsie had never seen before. She wore a dress of deep blue linen, finely embroidered at the cuffs, and her dark hair was pinned with a silver clasp. She was not beautiful in any extraordinary way, but she stood close to Owen with an ease that spoke of familiarity. Elsie's stomach turned over quietly. "Who is she?" she asked. "I don't know," Mara said. Her voice was too careful. The gathering formally began when the castle herald struck his staff against the stone floor 3 times and called the hall to attention. The crowd shifted and settled. Elsie and Mara moved to stand along the inner wall, among the other servants who had been permitted to witness the ceremony, a courtesy extended to household staff, though they were expected to remain near the edges. The ritual began with the warrior allegiances. Senior pack members rose one by one to reaffirm their loyalty to the ruling house, pressing a fist to their chest and speaking their names clearly into the silence. Then came the merchant declarations and the acknowledgement of new guild alliances. Elsie barely heard any of it. Her eyes stayed on Owen across the room. He had not looked at her once. When the herald announced the claiming portion of the evening, the mood in the hall shifted. This was what most of the younger wolves had come for, the moment when unmated pairs were acknowledged, when bonds were confirmed, when names were spoken aloud before witnesses and became real. Several couples stepped forward. An older beta claimed his mate of many years in a quiet, dignified reaffirmation that made some of the women near Elsie press hands to their hearts. Then Owen stepped forward. Elsie's breath caught. She straightened slightly. Beside her, Mara reached over and touched her arm once, not in reassurance, but in the way a person steadies someone they're afraid is about to fall. Owen stood in the space before the head table with his hands loose at his sides. His voice was clear and carried well. "I come before this gathering," he said, "to declare my intention toward Senna of the Heart Merchant family. Daughter of my father's closest ally, it is my family's wish, and my own, that this bond be recognized." The woman in the blue dress stepped forward to stand beside him. The hall murmured with approval. Elsie did not move. She was not certain she could. The sound of the hall seemed to grow distant, as though she were hearing everything from the bottom of a deep well. She was aware of the dried flowers at her collar. She was aware of 3 nights of candlelight and aching fingers. She was aware of Mara's hand still resting on her arm, gripping slightly tighter now. She did not cry. She had spent enough of her life learning not to cry in front of people who would not understand why. She lifted her chin. She straightened her spine. And she turned toward the nearest side corridor that led away from the great hall, moving quietly, the way servants learn to move, without drawing attention, without making a sound, without asking anyone for anything. She was almost at the corridor entrance when it happened. The door at the far end of the passage burst open. 3 figures stumbled through it. 2 men she did not recognize, rough-looking, wearing no house colors, their cloaks dark and unmarked. Between them, struggling and twisting, was a boy of perhaps 10 years, dressed in the black and crimson of House Vale. His dark hair was disheveled, and there was a cut above his brow, but his jaw was set with a stubbornness that was almost impressive for someone his size. One of the men pressed a blade to the boy's side. "Quiet," the man growled. "One sound and—" He didn't finish the sentence, because Elsie stepped directly into their path. She did not think. There was no calculation in it, no courage that she had prepared in advance. She simply moved, the way a person moves when their body acts before their mind catches up. And she placed herself between the 2 armed men and the boy, her arms slightly out at her sides, her golden dress catching the dim torchlight of the corridor. "Let him go," she said. Her voice was steady. She was faintly amazed by that. The man with the blade stared at her. For a moment, he almost laughed. "Get out of the way, girl." "No," Elsie said. From the doorway at the far end of the corridor came the sound of heavy, rapid footsteps. But Elsie did not look away from the blade. "Don't be afraid," she said quietly. And she wasn't certain if she was speaking to the boy or to herself. "I'm here." The man moved faster than she expected. The blade came up, not toward the boy, but toward her. and Elsie did not step back. She shifted sideways instead, the way she had learned to move in crowded kitchen corridors when someone swung a heavy pot without looking, and the edge caught her left arm just below the shoulder rather than across her throat, which had clearly been the intention. The pain was sharp and immediate. She felt the warmth of blood before she fully understood what had happened. The boy made a sound. Not a cry, but something fierce and wordless, and drove his elbow hard into the ribs of the man holding him. It was not enough to break free, but it was enough to make the man grunt and shift his grip. And in that half-second of disorder, Elsie grabbed the wooden torch bracket mounted on the corridor wall and pulled it from its iron fitting with both hands. She swung it. She was not a warrior. She had no training, no pack strength, no enhanced speed. She was an Omega servant girl in a wheat-colored dress, and the bracket was heavy and graceless, and she swung it the way a person swings something when they are simply trying to make something stop. It struck the man with the blade across the forearm. He dropped the knife with a sharp curse. That was all the time that was needed. The door at the end of the corridor, the one that connected to the main body of the castle, exploded open with a force that shook dust from the ceiling stones. 4 royal guards poured through it in full armor, swords drawn, and behind them, moving with a stillness that somehow made him more terrifying than the armed men around him, came Sebastian Vielle. The Alpha King filled the corridor, the way a storm fills a valley. Not loudly, not with chaos, but with a pressure that changed the air itself. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, dressed in black leather fitted close across his chest with 2 crossed straps of darker leather, a mane of black braids falling past his shoulders, and a fur-lined mantle so dark it seemed to absorb the torchlight. His eyes were the color of deep winter water, blue so pale it was nearly gray, and they swept the corridor in less than a heartbeat. They landed on the boy first, then on the 2 men now pinned to the wall by his guards, then on Elsie. She was still holding the torch bracket. Her left arm was bleeding. She became aware of both of these things at approximately the same moment, and she lowered the bracket carefully and tried to stand straight, because she was not certain what else to do. The boy wrenched himself free of the loosened grip and crossed the corridor in 4 quick steps, stopping just short of the Alpha King. He was trying very hard to look as though nothing significant had happened. He was failing slightly, because his hands were trembling. "I'm unharmed," the boy said. His voice had that same stubborn set as his jaw. "Father." Sebastian Vielle looked at his son for a long moment. Something passed across his face. Relief, carefully controlled, folded down beneath the surface before anyone could fully read it. "Cale," he said. Just the name. Nothing else. But the way he said it carried the weight of everything he was not saying. Then he looked at Elsie again. She met his gaze. She was not entirely sure why. Looking away from an Alpha King, especially this one, the one they called the Iron Wolf, the one whose name made lesser pack lords go quiet at council tables, was probably the appropriate response for an unmated Omega servant with no house and no standing. But her arm was bleeding, and her heart was still hammering from the last 2 minutes, and she found she did not have the presence of mind to perform the correct social behavior. "You're hurt," Sebastian said. His voice was lower than she had expected. Not softer. It was not a soft voice, but quieter. Like distant thunder rather than the kind directly overhead. "It's not deep," Elsie said. "I didn't ask for your assessment." She blinked. "No. I suppose you didn't." One of the guards, a broad-shouldered man with a gray-streaked beard, whom she vaguely recognized as the captain of the Royal House Guard, turned from the 2 prisoners and looked at Elsie with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not unkindness. Something more like recalibration, as though he were adjusting an assumption he had arrived with. "She stepped in front of them," Cale said. He was speaking to his father, his voice carrying the particular insistence of someone who needs something to be understood correctly. They had a blade at my side and she walked directly into their path. She told them to let me go. Sebastian did not respond immediately. He was still looking at Elsie, and she had the uncomfortable sensation of being read. Not her appearance, but something beneath it, something she could not hide or arrange into a more favorable presentation. "Your name," he said. "Elsie." She paused. "I serve in the castle kitchens. I have no house name." "I know," he said. That surprised her enough that she almost asked how. But the Alpha King had already turned to his captain. "Take these men to the lower cells. I want answers before dawn." He glanced at the two prisoners, cold, assessing, completely without fury, which was somehow more frightening than anger would have been. "And I will have them." The men were dragged away without ceremony. Sebastian turned back and looked at Cale again, more carefully this time, checking him with the focused attention of a man running through a list of concerns and eliminating them one by one. The cut above the boy's brow, the state of his clothing, the way he was holding his left wrist slightly close to his body. "Show me your wrist," Sebastian said. Cale hesitated, then extended it. There was bruising already forming where the man had gripped him. Sebastian's expression did not change, but something in his eyes did. It was brief and it was controlled, but Elsie saw it. She understood what it was. She had no children and no family, but she recognized the particular way a person's face shifts when someone they love has been hurt and they are not permitted to show how much that matters. He turned to the captain again. "Escort Prince Cale to the healer's quarters. Stay with him." "Father." "Cale." The boy closed his mouth. He looked for just a moment very young, and then he reassembled his expression into something closer to dignity and nodded. Before he followed the captain, he stopped and turned back to Elsie. "Thank you," he said. Plainly, directly, without the performance of court manners. Just the words and the meaning behind them. Elsie nodded once. "Go with the guard. Get your wrist seen to." He almost smiled. Then he was gone, his footsteps fading down the corridor toward the healer's wing. The corridor was suddenly very quiet. Elsie became aware that she was alone with the Alpha King, that her arm was still bleeding onto the floor in slow, patient drops, and that her wheat-colored dress now had a dark stain spreading from just below the left shoulder. 3 nights of candlelight and small dried flowers and careful stitching, and she had managed to get blood on it within the same hour she'd first put it on. "Come," Sebastian said. "My lord, I am quite capable of walking to the—" "I'm not asking," he said, not unkindly, but with the absolute certainty of a man who has never had to ask twice for anything. He turned and walked, and Elsie, after a single moment of internal debate that she lost decisively, followed him. He brought her to a small chamber off the main corridor, a room that functioned, she realized, as a kind of secondary council space, with a heavy table, 2 chairs, candles in iron holders, and a narrow wooden cabinet against the far wall. He opened the cabinet and removed a cloth, a small clay jar of dark salve, and a length of clean linen bandaging that looked as though it had been placed there by someone who understood that people in this castle occasionally required emergency medical attention. He set them on the table and looked at her arm. "Sit," he said. She sat. He examined the wound with the same focused attention he had turned on everything else, not squeamishly, not with excessive tenderness, but with a kind of careful precision. His hands were large and marked with old scars, the hands of a man who had fought many battles and won all of them, and they moved with a gentleness that seemed almost at odds with everything else about him. "You didn't run," he said, while he worked. "No," Elsie agreed. "Most people would have." Most people weren't already standing there. He glanced up at her then, just briefly. She couldn't fully interpret the look, but she held it without looking away, because she had been doing that all evening, and she was beginning to think it was simply what her face did now. "You were leaving the gathering," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Why?" She considered several answers and discarded all of them. It seemed like the right time to go. Sebastian said nothing. He pressed the salve gently into the cut, and she kept her jaw still and did not make a sound. And he wrapped the linen bandaging around her arm with 3 careful, even passes and tied it with a precision that spoke of long practice. Then he sat back and looked at her. "You stepped between an armed man and my son," he said, "without a weapon, without pack reinforcement, without any reasonable expectation of surviving it." "I had the torch bracket," Elsie said. Elsie. The way he said her name, just her name, no title, no designation, the same word she'd given him 2 minutes ago in a bleeding corridor, stopped whatever she had been about to say next. "Why?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, the way she always thought about things when she was too tired or too shaken to perform the easier answer. "He was frightened," she said. "And he was trying very hard not to show it, and I couldn't walk past that." The Alpha King looked at her for a long moment in the candlelight of the small stone room, and Elsie could not read his expression with any confidence. But she had the distinct and slightly unnerving feeling that he was reading hers with perfect clarity. "You will not return to the kitchens tonight," he said finally. "I'll have a chamber prepared in the east wing." "My lord, that isn't necessary. Someone just tried to take my son," Sebastian said, and his voice was very quiet now. "I don't yet know how they knew his location, which means I don't yet know how far inside these walls this reaches. Until I do, anyone who has seen what happened in that corridor stays where I can account for them." He stood. "That includes you." Elsie looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded. "All right," she said. The East Wing chamber was nothing like the servants' quarters. Elsie stood in the doorway for a moment before entering, taking in the unfamiliar dimensions of it. The ceiling higher than she was accustomed to. The stone walls hung with tapestries in deep burgundy and gray that softened the cold of the granite. A narrow bed with actual wool blankets folded at its foot. A writing table with 2 unlit candles, and a window with thick shutters that looked out over the inner courtyard. It was not a grand chamber by the standards of Iron Vale's nobility, but to Elsie, who shared a sleeping room with 7 other kitchen servants and owned exactly 1 wooden chest of personal belongings, it felt vast and strange and quietly overwhelming. Mara found her 20 minutes later, slipping through the door with the practiced invisibility of someone who had spent years learning how to be in places without anyone deciding she shouldn't be. "I heard," Mara said immediately, closing the door behind her and turning to look at Elsie with an expression that balanced relief and barely contained distress in equal measure. Her eyes went straight to the bandaged arm. "How bad?" "It's fine. It's been seen to." "Seen to by whom?" Elsie paused. Mara stared at her. "Elsie." "The Alpha King was present when it happened," Elsie said carefully. "He had the bandaging." The silence that followed was extremely loud. "He bandaged your arm," Mara said slowly. "He had the materials and I was bleeding. It was practical." "Sebastian Vale," Mara said, as though perhaps Elsie had confused the man with someone else entirely. "The Iron Wolf, king of the Vale Pack and sovereign of the Iron Vale territory. That man bandaged your arm. I didn't ask him to." Elsie. Mara. They looked at each other. Then Mara crossed the room and sat down heavily on the edge of the writing table, pressing one hand to her forehead. "Tell me everything," she said. "From the beginning. Leave nothing out," Elsie told her. She told it plainly and in order, the way she always relayed information, without embellishment, without the dramatic pauses that the castle's storytellers favored. Just the sequence of events as they had occurred. The corridor. The 2 men. The boy. The bracket. The blade catching her arm. The guards. Sebastian. When she finished, Mara was quiet for a long moment. "And Owen?" she asked. "Claimed Senna of his father's merchant alliance," Elsie said, in front of the full gathering. Mara looked at her steadily. "Are you all right?" "Yes." Elsie considered it more honestly. "I will be. I think I already knew somewhere. I just hadn't admitted it yet." "The dress is beautiful," Mara said quietly. "Even with—" She gestured at the stain. "3 nights of work," Elsie said, and her voice was entirely level, which she felt was an achievement. "And I bled on it within the hour." Mara looked at her for a moment, and then did something unexpected. She laughed. Not unkindly, not at the situation exactly, but the way people laugh when the absurdity of a thing becomes the only honest response to it. And after a moment, despite everything, Elsie found herself laughing too. Quietly, tiredly, in the dim light of an East Wing chamber that didn't belong to her, with a bandaged arm and a ruined dress, and a night that had gone entirely differently than she had planned. It helped, somehow. It helped considerably. Morning came gray and cold through the shuttered window. Elsie had slept badly, but slept nonetheless, and she rose before the bells and dressed in the plain garments a castle servant had brought the previous evening. A simple tunic of dark gray linen and a heavier overdress of brown wool, practical and warm. Nothing like the wheat-colored gown now folded carefully at the bottom of the wooden chest. She was not certain what she was supposed to do with herself. The instruction had been to remain in the East Wing. Beyond that, no one had clarified her status, whether she was a guest, a witness, or something with no precise name at all. She had always been good at existing in the spaces between defined categories, but this felt different in ways she couldn't fully articulate. She was considering this when someone knocked at her door. Not a servant's knock. The quick, apologetic tap of someone who doesn't want to be a burden. This was a single, deliberate knock. The kind made by someone who is accustomed to knocking on doors and having them open immediately. She opened it. The boy, Prince Kale, stood in the corridor. His dark hair was combed back from his face, and the cut above his brow had been cleaned and treated, a thin line of dried salve visible across it. His left wrist was wrapped in linen. He was dressed in the black and crimson of his house, properly this time, and he was carrying a small clay bowl covered with a cloth, which he extended toward her with an expression of determined composure. "The healer said you should change the dressing this morning," he said. "I brought the salve." Elsie looked at him. She looked at the bowl. She looked back at him. "Did the healer send you?" she asked. "Or did you decide to come?" He held her gaze steadily. He had his father's eyes, she noticed. That same pale winter blue. "Does it matter?" "It matters in terms of whether the healer actually told you anything about changing dressings, or whether you simply came and are now attributing the instruction to a medical authority in order to make it harder for me to send you away." A pause. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. "The healer did say the dressing should be changed. That part I believe. The rest I'm less certain about." He looked at her with that composed, assessing expression that was so clearly inherited it was almost startling. "You're not frightened of me," he observed. "You're 10 years old and you're holding a bowl of salve," Elsie said. "No, I'm not." "I'm 11, he corrected, with the particular dignity of someone for whom this distinction matters enormously. "My apologies," Elsie said, and stepped back from the door. "Come in then, and thank you for the salve." He entered with the careful dignity of someone who was pretending he did this sort of thing routinely. He set the bowl on the writing table. Elsie sat in the chair and unwrapped her own bandaging. It was her left arm and she could manage it well enough. While Kale stood nearby in the manner of someone who wants to help, but is unsure if offering would be considered appropriate. "It's healing cleanly," she said, examining the cut. It was true. Not deep enough to cause lasting concern, already beginning to close at the edges. "You should have let the guards handle it," Cale said. His voice had shifted slightly. Quieter. The guards weren't there yet. You didn't know they were coming? No, Elsie agreed. I didn't. He was quiet for a moment. Weren't you afraid? She thought about it genuinely, because he deserved a genuine answer. I was afraid after, she said. During, I was too busy to be afraid. That's usually how it works. He considered this seriously, the way children consider things when they are actually listening rather than waiting for the adult to finish speaking. The men who took me, he said carefully. My father will find out who sent them. Yes, Elsie said. I believe he will. He always does, Cale said. And there was something in those 3 words. Not boastfulness, not comfort-seeking, but a plain and total certainty. That told her more about the relationship between the boy and his father than any formal description could have. She finished applying the salve and wound fresh linen around her arm. Cale watched with serious attention. You should stay, he said when she was done. She looked at him. In the East Wing, he clarified. Or somewhere in the castle, not the kitchens. He paused. It would be safer. That decision, Elsie said gently, isn't really mine to make. My father could make it. Your father has considerably more important concerns this morning than where a kitchen servant sleeps. You're not... He stopped himself. Started again. You're not only a kitchen servant. Elsie looked at him for a moment. He was looking back at her with that pale, direct gaze, and she understood that he meant it simply, without flattery, as a plain statement of what he believed to be factually true. Thank you, Cale, she said quietly. He nodded once with great seriousness. Then he picked up the empty bowl and moved toward the door, pausing at the threshold. My father wants to speak with you this morning, he said. After the council meeting. I thought you should know, so you could... He seemed to search for the right word. Prepare. Did he send you to tell me that as well? Elsie asked. Or did you decide to come? He looked at her steadily. Does it matter? She held back a smile with genuine effort. Go have your breakfast, my Lord Prince. He went, with the careful dignity he'd carried in, and Elsie sat alone in the East Wing chamber and listened to his footsteps fade down the stone corridor. She did not let herself think too long about what the Alpha King wanting to speak with her might mean. She was practical by nature and experience, and practicality told her that there were exactly 2 likely reasons for such a meeting. Either Sebastian Vielle wished to formally thank her and send her back to the kitchens with perhaps a small coin purse as acknowledgement, or something had emerged from the night's interrogation of the prisoners that made her continued presence a matter of security, rather than sentiment. She was almost entirely certain it was one of those 2 things. She told herself this with some conviction while she sat in the gray morning light and listened to the castle bells mark the hour, and tried not to think about the way Sebastian's voice had sounded when he said her name in the corridor. Not her designation, not girl or servant or woman, but her name, with the particular weight of someone who had already decided it was worth remembering. The council chamber was on the 2nd floor of the castle's northern tower. Elsie knew this because a guard had come to her door at mid-morning. Not the apologetic kind of summons, a servant sent with a message, but an actual royal guard in full house colors who stood in her doorway and said simply that the Alpha King was ready to receive her. She had followed him up 2 flights of winding stone stairs, past narrow windows that looked out over the gray autumn sky above Ironvale's outer walls, and had arrived at a heavy oak door banded with iron that the guard opened without knocking. The room beyond was smaller than she had imagined. She had expected grandeur, the kind of theatrical display of authority that lesser lords used to remind visitors of their own smallness. But the council chamber of Sebastian Vielle was a working room, spare and purposeful. Maps covered the central table, weighted at their corners with iron discs. Candles burned in clusters along the walls. A cold hearth waited at the far end, unlit. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled not with decorative volumes, but with the kind of worn, annotated records that come from actual use over many years. 2 men stood near the table when she entered. She recognized the gray-bearded guard captain from the corridor the night before. The other man she did not know. Tall and lean, with sharp features and copper-colored hair pulled back from his face. Dressed in dark traveling clothes that suggested he had arrived recently and not yet changed. He was watching her with the alert, calculating expression of someone who assessed things for a living and was currently assessing her. Sebastian stood at the window. He turned when she entered, and she was struck again by the quality of his stillness, the way he occupied space without filling it unnecessarily, as though he had long ago made peace with precisely how much room he needed and required nothing more. In the morning light, he looked less like a force of nature and more like a man who had not slept, though the exhaustion was buried deeply enough that most people would not have noticed it. She noticed it. "Elsie," he said, "come in." She crossed the room and stopped a respectful distance from the table. The guard captain nodded at her once. The copper-haired man continued his quiet assessment with no acknowledgement at all, which she decided to take as a neutral rather than hostile sign. "This is Ran," Sebastian said, gesturing toward the copper-haired man. "My chief intelligence officer. He has been conducting the interrogation of our prisoners since before dawn." Ran inclined his head slightly. "You're the servant who stepped into the corridor." "Yes," Elsie said. "Brave?" he said, or uninformed about the statistical likelihood of surviving that situation. "Possibly both," Elsie said. Something moved briefly at the edge of Rand's expression. Not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. Sebastian moved from the window to the table, resting his hands on the edge of it and looking at her directly. "The men who took Kale have been identified. They were hired by a minor lord from the Southern Territories, a man who has been quietly building alliances against the Vile Pack for the past 2 years. He believed that taking the prince would give him leverage in the upcoming Council of Lords." "Will he be dealt with?" Elsie asked. "He already has been," Sebastian said, and his tone made very clear that the matter was closed in the most permanent sense available. Elsie nodded once. "What I need to understand," Sebastian continued, "is how those men knew Kale's location within the castle last night. The harvest gathering was a large event with many visitors. Someone provided them with information about the prince's movements." He paused. "You were in the corridor because you were leaving the hall. What did you see before you encountered them?" She understood then. This was not a courtesy meeting. This was a witness account. She told him everything she remembered, the timing of when she had left the hall, the direction she had come from, the state of the corridor before the door burst open, whether she had passed anyone on her way. She had a precise memory, and she used it, noting details she had not consciously registered at the time, but found still present when she reached for them. The specific door the men had come through, the direction they had been moving, the fact that the man who held the blade had known exactly which corridor to use without hesitation, as though he had walked it before. That last detail made Rand straighten slightly. "You're certain?" he said. "No checking of the walls, no hesitation at the junction point?" "None," Elsie said. He moved like he knew where he was going. Rand looked at Sebastian. Something passed between them in the way of men who have worked together long enough to communicate without words. "That confirms the internal source," Rand said. Sebastian nodded. His jaw was set. Rand turned back to Elsie. "How long have you served in the castle kitchens?" 4 years. "And before that?" "A village 2 days' ride east, Thornfield. My mother was a healer there." She paused. "She died when I was 19. There was nothing to stay for." "Your designation?" Ran asked. "Omega." She said it plainly, without the reflexive apology that some omegas attach to the word in the presence of alphas. It was simply what she was. Ran glanced at Sebastian again. This time the look was slightly different, less tactical, more curious. Sebastian did not return it. He was looking at Elsie. "Your mother was a healer," he said. "Yes." "In Thornfield." He said the name of the village as though it meant something specific to him. "What was her name?" Elsie looked at him. "Marin." "Why?" Sebastian was quiet for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite the controlled neutrality he maintained as a matter of practice, but a slight change in the quality of his attention, as though a detail had just aligned with something he had already known, and the alignment was not entirely a surprise. "Your mother treated soldiers from the Eastern Campaign," he said. 14 years ago, a field station outside Thornfield. She opened her home to the wounded." "Yes," Elsie said slowly. "I remember. I was young, but I remember." "I passed through Thornfield during that campaign," Sebastian said. "I was not yet king. I had a wound in my side that had gone 3 days without proper attention." She stared at him. "Your mother treated it," he said. "She was precise, efficient. She did not make a ceremony of the fact that I was an alpha, and she was an omega healer in a village with a dirt floor. She simply did the work." A pause. "I have not forgotten that." The room was very quiet. Elsie was doing something she rarely did, which was failing to think of an immediate response. She was looking at Sebastian Vielle, who was looking back at her, and she was understanding something she had not known how to name since the night before. That peculiar sense of being seen not as a category, but as a specific person, with a specific weight and a specific history. "She never mentioned it," Elsie said finally. "She wouldn't have," Sebastian said. "She didn't seem to find it remarkable." "She didn't find most things remarkable," Elsie said. "She just did what needed doing." "Yes," Sebastian said quietly. "I noticed." Rand cleared his throat, not urgently, but with the practiced timing of a man who understood when a conversation had moved into territory that no longer required an intelligence officer's presence. "I have what I need from the witness account," he said, collecting his notes from the table. "Captain, shall we?" The gray-bearded captain followed him without comment, and the door closed behind both of them with the particular care of 2 men who were pretending they were simply leaving, rather than deliberately creating privacy. Elsie and Sebastian were alone in the council chamber. She remained where she was, standing on her side of the table, her bandaged arm at her side, her back straight. He remained where he was, hands resting on the table's edge, watching her with those pale winter eyes that she was beginning to understand did not miss very much at all. "You should not return to the kitchens," he said. "Your son said the same thing," Elsie said. "My son is occasionally correct." "What would I do instead?" she asked. Not defensively, practically. She was a practical person. "I have no skills beyond serving and basic healing knowledge. I have no house, no pack, no rank. You have better observational skills than half my guard," Sebastian said. "You have composure under duress that most trained soldiers spend years trying to develop. And you have the instinct to place yourself between danger and someone who cannot yet defend himself." He paused. "Those are not nothing, Elsie." She heard her name again in his mouth, and she was beginning to understand that he used it deliberately, not casually, not as a designation, but as a specific choice, the way a person reaches for a particular word because it is the most accurate one available. "What are you offering?" she asked. "A position in the household," he said. "Not the kitchens. As a companion to the prince, an attendant with actual authority over his daily schedule and safety. Kale trusts his own judgment too completely, and his guard not enough." Something moved briefly in his expression. He needs someone who will be honest with him, someone he will actually listen to. "He barely knows me," Elsie said. "He came to your chamber this morning with salve," Sebastian said. He knows you well enough." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved against the tower stones, and the candle flames bent slightly in the draft from the window. "And if I accept," she said carefully, "I would remain in the East Wing?" "You would be given permanent chambers there, yes." He held her gaze. "You would be under the protection of House Vale." The weight of that last sentence was not lost on her. Pack protection, formal, acknowledged, bound by the laws that governed every wolf within Iron Vale's territory. For an unmated Omega who had lived 4 years without it, who had stood alone at the edge of a harvest gathering in a dress she had sewn herself waiting for a man to give her a name that could shield her. The offer was so far beyond what the evening had begun as that she almost did not know how to hold it. She thought of Owen stepping forward to claim someone else. She thought of the wheat-colored dress with the bloodstain on the shoulder. She thought of Mara's hand gripping her arm in the great hall. She thought of Cale saying, "You're not only a kitchen servant," with his father's eyes and his father's directness, and meaning it as a simple statement of fact. "All right," she said. Sebastian looked at her steadily for a moment. "All right?" "Yes," she said. "I accept." He nodded once. The same gesture she had seen Cale make, she realized. That economy of acknowledgement that was apparently inherited rather than learned. Then he straightened from the table. "Ran will arrange the formal documentation," he said. "You'll have access to the household records so you can learn Cale's schedule. He will resist parts of it. He resists everything initially, out of principle." "I suspected as much," Elsie said. "Don't let him." "I won't," she said simply. Something shifted at the very corner of Sebastian's expression. Not quite a smile, but the recognition of one. Held just below the surface with the practiced restraint of a man who had long ago decided that not everything he felt required a visible expression. "Good," he said. Winter came to Iron Vale the way it always did, without ceremony, without warning, overnight. Elsie woke one morning 3 months after the harvest gathering to find the inner courtyard below her window, covered in the first snow of the season, thin and pale, barely enough to hide the cobblestones beneath. She stood at the shuttered window for a moment with her hands wrapped around a clay cup of hot water steeped with dried herbs, a habit from her mother's house that she had never abandoned, and watched the snow settle, and thought about how completely different everything looked from this window than it had from the servants' quarters on the castle's western side. Not better or worse, just entirely, irreversibly different. The months had passed with a rhythm she had not anticipated. She had expected resistance. From the household staff, from the guards, from the nobility who occasionally moved through the castle, and noticed, with visible surprise, an Omega, with no house name, sitting at the table in Cale's morning lessons, rather than serving at it. Some of that resistance had come. There were looks. There were comments made in corridors that stopped just short of being said to her face. There was a particular noble lady from the Western Territories who had visited in the 2nd month and spent an entire formal dinner addressing every remark intended for Elsie directly to the guard standing behind her chair, as though Elsie's presence at the table were a navigational error rather than a deliberate arrangement. Elsie had handled it the way her mother had handled most things, by continuing to do the work, precisely and without complaint, until the quality of the work became impossible to argue with. Cale had helped in his way. He was not an easy charge. He was sharp and impatient and deeply skeptical of any authority he had not personally decided to respect, which was a quality that Elsie privately found more admirable than she was supposed to. He argued with his tutors. He argued with his guard rotation. He had very specific opinions about everything, and expressed them with a directness that made older nobles visibly uncomfortable. He did not argue with Elsie. Not because she required obedience. She had made clear from the beginning that she was not interested in performing authority for its own sake, but because she had established very early on that she would be honest with him, even when honesty was inconvenient, and he had recognized this as something worth not wasting. "You don't treat me like I might break," he had told her once, during a long afternoon in the castle library when he was supposed to be studying territorial maps, and was instead asking her questions about her mother's village. "Should I?" she had asked. "Everyone else does, since the gathering." "You didn't break," Elsie had said simply. "You were afraid and you didn't break. Those are different things." He had been quiet for a moment, and then he had returned to the maps without further comment. But she had noticed that he sat slightly differently after that. Something in his shoulders less carefully arranged. Sebastian was a more complicated presence. He was not a man who appeared frequently or without purpose. He had a kingdom to govern, a council of lords who required constant management, a border dispute in the eastern territories that had demanded 2 separate military delegations in the past month alone, and the ongoing investigation into whoever within the castle walls had provided the hired men with information about Cale's movements on the night of the gathering. That last matter had been resolved in the 6th week. The source had been a senior household steward, a man who had served Ironvale for 11 years and had been quietly in the pay of the Southern Lord for the last 3 of them. Sebastian had dealt with it without public spectacle, which Elsie had come to understand was characteristic of him. He did not perform justice. He enacted it, cleanly and completely, and moved on. But in the spaces between all of it, the council meetings and the military dispatches and the territorial negotiations, Sebastian appeared. Not dramatically, not in ways that announced themselves. He appeared at the edge of the practice yard when Cale was working with the guard captain on basic defensive training, standing at the far wall with his arms crossed, watching. He appeared in the library on 2 occasions when Elsie was there with Cale, settling into a chair at the other end of the room with a ledger he needed to review, not interrupting, simply present. He appeared at the doorway of the East Wing corridor one evening when Elsie was returning from the kitchens. She had gone to check on Mara, who had caught a winter chill, and he had stopped and looked at her bandaged arm, which had long since healed, and then looked at her face. "How is your arm?" he had asked. "Completely healed these 2 months," she had said. "And Mara?" She had paused. She had not told him she was going to see Mara. Better. The healer gave her something for the chill. "Good," he had said. And then he had nodded and continued down the corridor, and Elsie had stood in the passage for a moment longer than necessary before continuing toward her own chamber. She had told herself, on multiple occasions, that she was not going to do what she appeared to be doing, which was paying very careful attention to when Sebastian Vielle was in a room, and where in that room he was, and whether he was looking in her direction. She was not especially successful at this. The conversation that changed things happened on a night in deep winter, when the snow outside was no longer thin and pale but heavy and serious, and the castle fires burned high in every hearth. Elsie had been in the great library returning a volume she had borrowed for Cale's lessons when she found Sebastian already there, standing at the shelves along the eastern wall, with a candle in one hand and a map scroll in the other, frowning at something in the way he frowned at things, not with frustration, but with the focused attention of a man running through every possibility until he found the right one. She had almost retreated. She would have retreated. But he had already heard her, alpha hearing being what it was, and turned before she could manage it. "Don't go," he said. She stayed. She set the volume on the return shelf and remained near the door, not quite leaving, not quite approaching, occupying the middle ground with the particular composure she had developed over a lifetime of uncertain situations. Sebastian set the map scroll on the reading table and looked at her for a moment. "Cale asked me today," he said, "whether I intended to find him a new pack mother." Elsie was very still. "He said he didn't want one," Sebastian continued, "unless it was someone who didn't treat him like he might break." A pause. He was quite specific about that particular criterion. "He mentioned that it mattered to him," Elsie said carefully. "He mentioned you," Sebastian said. The library was very quiet. Snow moved against the high windows in soft, inaudible waves, and the candles burned without flickering in the still indoor air. Sebastian! It was the first time she had used his name without a title. She realized it at exactly the same moment he did. She did not apologize for it. I know what I am, she said. I know my rank and my designation and the fact that I came to this castle with a wooden chest and a kitchen assignment and nothing else. I'm not unaware of the distance between where I stand and where you stand. I know you're not, he said. You're the least unaware person I have encountered in a very long time. Then you understand why I'm being careful. I understand it, he said. I'm not certain I agree with the necessity of it. She looked at him across the library, in the candlelight and the winter quiet. And she thought about her mother working in a dirt-floored cottage treating a wounded alpha, who hadn't yet become a king, doing what needed doing without making a ceremony of the distance between them. She thought about 3 nights of candlelight and a wheat-colored dress, and the moment she had understood that Owen Hart had never actually seen her. Not truly. Not as a specific person with a specific weight. She thought about the way Sebastian said her name. What are you asking me? She said. He crossed the library toward her. Not quickly, not with the sudden motion of impulse, but with the deliberate calm of a man who had made a decision and was enacting it with the same quiet certainty he brought to everything. He stopped close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes. I made a promise, he said. The night of the gathering. Not aloud, not to you, but I made it. She waited. You walked into danger for my son without hesitation, he said. And when I found you in that corridor, you were bleeding and holding a torch bracket, and you looked at me without flinching. A pause. I promised myself that I would not let that go unreturned. You gave me a position, Elsie said. Chambers, pack protection. That was the beginning, Sebastian said, not the whole of it. She held his gaze. The pale winter blue of his eyes, up close, was not cold. She had always thought of it as cold, the color of distant ice, of authority held at arm's length. But at this distance it was something else entirely, the color of winter sky just before dawn, which was not cold so much as it was clear. I'm not asking you to decide tonight, he said. I'm not asking you to decide anything before you're ready, but I want you to know what I am asking, so that you understand it clearly. Tell me clearly then, she said. I want you to stay, he said, not as Cale's attendant, not as a household position, as mine. He held her gaze, steady and certain. I want to claim you, Elsie, before the pack, before witnesses, with your name beside mine. The snow moved against the windows. The candles burned. Elsie thought about everything this meant, about what it would change, and what it would cost, and what it would give her. She thought about Mara, who would laugh and cry at the same time, and would probably take credit for the entire sequence of events somehow. She thought about Cale, who had arrived at her door with a bowl of salve, and said, "You're not only a kitchen servant with his father's eyes and his absolute certainty." She thought about her mother, precise and efficient, who had treated a wounded wolf in a dirt-floored cottage without making a ceremony of the distance between them, and who had died never knowing that the wolf remembered. "All right," she said. Sebastian looked at her. "All right," he said, and there was something different in his voice now. Not the careful control of a king measuring his words, but something underneath it. Something that had been waiting. "Yes," Elsie said. "I'll stay." The claiming ceremony was held on the first clear day after the winter solstice, when the snow lay thick and bright across the Iron Vale courtyard, and the morning sky was the particular shade of pale blue that reminded Elsie, every time she saw it, of a pair of eyes she had first looked into across a blood-stained corridor. The hall was full. Every pack member of standing had been called to witness, and they came, because when the Iron Wolf called, people came. Nobles who had looked through Elsie for 3 months stood in the same stone hall where she had once served their wine, and watched Sebastian Vielle speak her name before all of them, with the same quiet certainty he brought to everything, and formally acknowledge her as his chosen mate. Mara stood near the inner wall, exactly where she and Elsie had stood together on the night of the harvest gathering, and she was doing exactly what Elsie had predicted. Trying to hold a composed expression and failing entirely, pressing the back of her hand to her mouth and looking at the ceiling with bright, determined eyes. Cale stood at his father's right side, straight-backed and composed, wearing his house colors with the particular dignity of someone who felt that the occasion was going correctly, and found this deeply satisfying. When Elsie caught his eye across the hall, he gave her a single, small nod. The same economy of acknowledgement she had come to recognize as the family's particular language for everything they meant most sincerely. Owen Hart was there as well, standing near the merchant section of the hall with his Merchant Alliance wife at his side, and an expression on his face that Elsie noticed, and then set down without lingering over. She did not hate him. She had thought she might, and found she didn't. He had simply been unable to see her, and the men who could not see her had never been the right men. And the night he had chosen Senna had sent her into a corridor where she had found exactly what she had been worth all along, waiting to be recognized by the right eyes. She did not need him to understand what he had lost. She already knew. In the years that followed, the people of Iron Vale told the story of the Alpha King and his Omega mate in the way that all good stories eventually travel, slightly changed with each telling, gaining detail here and losing precision there, but preserving at its center the thing that made it worth telling at all. They said she had walked into danger without a weapon and without fear. They said he had seen her in a corridor with a torch bracket and blood on her dress, and recognized something that no one else had been paying attention to. They said the prince had brought her salve on the morning after, and that this had been the beginning of everything, though this part was disputed. They said that Sebastian Vielle, who had built his reputation on a stillness that most men mistook for coldness, had spoken her name in the claiming ceremony with the particular quietness of a man saying aloud something he had already known for a long time. And Elsie, who had arrived at Ironvale Castle with a wooden chest and a kitchen assignment, who had sewn a wheat-colored dress by candlelight and worn it to a gathering where no one had chosen her, who had stepped into a dark corridor one autumn night because a boy was frightened, and she could not walk past that, stood at the window of the East Wing chamber that had become her home, on an ordinary winter morning with a cup of herb-steeped water warm between her hands, and watched the snow settle over the courtyard below. Cale grew into a king worth following, patient and direct and disinclined to cruelty, with his father's pale eyes and a stubborn streak that Elsie had stopped trying to discourage because she had come to understand it was one of his finest qualities. Mara was given proper chambers of her own and a position that suited her, managing the household staff with the brisk, affectionate efficiency she had always applied to everything, and she accepted this with the dignity of someone who felt it was entirely appropriate and long overdue. Sebastian kept his promise, not loudly, not with ceremony or decoration or the performed gestures of a man who needed his devotion witnessed, but in the consistent, daily, irreversible way of someone who had decided and did not revisit the decision, present at the window beside her in the mornings, steady at the council table beside her in the difficult seasons, his hand finding hers in the quiet dark of winter evenings by the fire. Small things. Chosen things. Things that did not require an audience. The kind of love that does not announce itself, because it does not need to. Because it is simply there. The way the stone walls of Iron Vale were there, the way the snow came every winter without ceremony, the way the candles burned in the library on the night a man crossed the room toward a woman and told her, plainly and without performance, that he intended to keep a promise he had made in silence. The kind that lasts,